Thank you all for coming. It's an honor for us to have you, Lilian and Thomas, and also for honoring us with the public premiere of the film. I think it would be a beautiful gesture before we begin the conversation to acknowledge some people in the film who are here. So maybe any one of you could do that, please.
Yeah, one of the stars of the film is here together with the family members, Madam C. Madam C, can you show your hands? We were so happy and so lucky to have Madam C. As you saw in the film, she was amazing. She sang, she taught us skills and a lot of things as well. But we didn't buy the lottery, unfortunately. Maybe we could have won. So thank you so much. And those the other elders who couldn't be with us, Madam, Mr. and Mrs. Goh, the couple that you saw, and then Madam Lim. So those were the elders that were really generous in sharing their lives with us. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's great to view this film amid the intense acceleration signified by F1. I think the film slows us down a bit and makes us reflect on what is around us. It's also interesting to see the film in relation to figuring a scene, the exhibition that I curated. In which the HDB form figures prominently. Yeah. So before we have this conversation with the audience, I'd like to open with questions on three relationships. The first is your relationship with the bigger project, which is the Whampoa project. So can you walk us through that context in which this particular film is situated? Yeah. So any one of you? Maybe Lilian? Mm-hmm.
On ready? Yeah. So as Lynette has given a context, Thomas is the principal investigator of the project itself, and there's myself as the co-investigator, and also Peter Chen, who is not together with us today, but he was also instrumental we took different parts of the project and worked with the different parts of the project. And Thomas was the overall person who also interacted with the South Foundation and worked very closely with the elders, and that's where we had our resource. I mean, that is the most valuable resource, the people. As opposed to, I think that although we both come from architecture, we were very interested to find out, because the grant itself, and we have to acknowledge it, is from the National Heritage Board. So they generously offered us this grant to be able to talk about everyday heritage, memory, and I think that both of us held this question because we also had a symposium, an online one. Interestingly, this project happened at the height, the grant was given at the height of COVID, and we couldn't do much, obviously, because this distancing, but also this is a group of vulnerable people. And I myself was not inside there and was directing Ian from a distance as he went to take footage, so also acknowledging Ian Munn, the filmmaker and one of the ex-graduates, the graduates from our Department of Architecture in NUS. He's now in Africa doing more filming for something else. He had a very close relationship, and I remember Madam Sim contracting COVID in the middle of the filming itself, and then Thomas and Ian had also got to go into isolation. You know, that time we had a protocol, so everybody went into isolation. So there were lots of stories there, and there is this film, and there's also the footage, which we don't show. I mean, there's quite a bit of footage which we have. And actually the footage itself shows you quite a lot. When Thomas mentions Madam Sim singing, there was a big part at the end where she was actually singing like in the karaoke. It was very entertaining. And I remember the songs because it was a Cantonese song from a very well-known TV series. I think that the different parts of the project was also the scanning of the objects. One of the big things that we had was to scan the objects, and that was done by Peter Chen. And Thomas set up a website where we put up photographs of these original objects and asked for the public to relate their comments about what they thought these objects were and their significance. Obviously, some of these objects didn't, people may not have any resonance with them because they are not of this time. But it was interesting to see the kind of comments that came up. Thomas has a much longer history of doing this. I came in because I was interested in continuing an investigation through film and to understand domesticity, how people lived. Also trying to understand the question of heritage, which we both had debates about what constitutes heritage, because the moment you, as we say, when you put something in heritage means it's in the past, but everything here is in the present. Everything is still being lived and used, and we see different patterns happening here with the sewing machine, Madam Sims, and then with the course, this difference between very slick electrical appliances, the coffee maker, the computer, the big television, flat screen, and then a very old and heavy pestle and mortar. And all the objects which Mrs. Cole says that she can't bear to throw away. And everything is, that house is, the flat is very spick and span. And then the third house, we look at the talismans which were there. So it's very interesting. Those two, you can say actually they're twin flats with two generations and the middle wall removed. And you see the middle wall there becomes a symmetry on left and right, and that beam itself holding the talismans to keep everything in balance. So it was interesting for us, I think, to be able to view how people lived, but also the kinds of things that are kept so that, and that's why it was called Objects for Thriving, rather than heritage or memory or anything like that. And we also thought that the flat is an object for thriving. It is an infrastructure that allowed them to be there and to keep living and to keep the things that they held dear inside, because without that home, they would not have that opportunity. Thomas might want to add on the social archiving project. Oh, you have your own.
Yeah, just continuing from what Lilian mentioned about, our kind of little concern about the word heritage. In fact, the title for our project was Social Curating and Archiving from Personal Possessions to Public Legacy. So, first and foremost, we want to take this archiving and curating activity out of the institutional context, putting it into a social context, putting it into places where people live, and then work together with them in the process of curating and archiving these things. So that's first and foremost what we try to do. We chose Whampoa because obviously Sao Foundation has been doing a lot of amazing work in Whampoa. And Mary Ann Sao, who is the chairperson, she asked, why don't you do something in Whampoa? I mean, there's a huge population of elders there, and they have been living there for over 40 years. So they have a rich history. They have amazing memory of growing up there, working there, getting married, raising a family and things like that. So that's how it got started, by turning their personal possessions into a public legacy in the form of a website, in the form of this film that you just watched, in the form of discussions and symposiums and things like that.
Thank you. The second relationship I'd like to tease out is something to do with the film, like the production of the film, and also the medium of film, and also your relationship with Ian Moon, and also with the elders. Yeah. So, can you walk us through that that very interesting process of making the film? Yeah. Thomas or Lilian? I think Lilian is pointing to you, Thomas.
I want Thomas to go through, because I was, as I said, I was away at home when the film was made. And I think that there was also a sense I felt that there was, when we were talking about caring for each other during the COVID period, I also felt at ease working with this team, because there was a consideration because I have asthma. And at that time, things were not very clear what would happen. And I chose not to go into the field. But Thomas and Ian actually went into the field and met some of these people and established a great relationship and friendship with them. Because you can't actually make a film without having a friendship. When you go into people's houses and you are in their personal space, it is impossible to have that possibility if you haven't established some kind of trust between the filmmaker and the person whose home the film is being made. Ian and I worked closely but also independently. So my interest has always been to see a space through the filmmaker's eyes, but I don't see it as that they are the camera person, because the camera person means I would direct them and they would do what I say. But I was interested because to understand how I myself, because we are trained in architectural history and theory, and we understand the kinds of policies and the way in which the HDB flat is being looked at. But then when you put a camera inside and a story starts to form, a narrative starts to form from people's lives, that flat has a very different resonance. And I'm interested to see the intersection between what we know from our discipline in architecture of public housing and how this same environment is being lived in, and how these two views are intersecting. And when it comes to us, it's also quite surprising sometimes to be able to see something that we have overlooked, or whether intentionally or unintentionally, because we have prioritized something else which was important. And obviously the beams and so on, obviously is our own architectural fascination that the beam is there, but the wall is not there. And then that wall itself is replaced by a series of hanging talismans that signify that something used to be there. And that balance is maintained now by something else that is not architectural, which is, you could say, is flimsy, but to someone who has that faith, it is stronger than the wall. And it was interesting for us to be able to understand that relationship between the tangible and the immaterial of objects that allow these lives to be lived and to be structured around them, not just the flat, but the objects, the domestic objects that are in the household. Did I miss any question that you asked?
It's a great response. Yeah, Thomas, you'd like to add?
Well, I was involved with the elders since 2014, almost 10 years ago. I was doing a project together with the Sound Foundation, and it was called Curating Wampo. That was where I got to know Mr. and Mrs. Goh as well. So as what Lilian mentioned, you cannot just parachute into someone's home and say, you know what, can you show us what you do every day? You get the door slammed in your face. But over time, when you cultivate that relationship, that trust, it becomes a lot easier, but also you get a deeper insight into their lives, right? So why film? I recall, Lilian, you were mentioning about using video ethnography as a way to be aware of how people live, right? And also using film as a form of essay that you begin to articulate, looking at the relationship of objects, of space, the possessions, and some of the intangible aspect as well, that you cannot really get to know if you were to just read something as a text. We will not be able to hear the wonderful song that Madam C sang, during that time. So film becomes a very powerful medium that I think both of us also encourage our students to use it as a way to really understand context about people, relationships, and their stories.
And as a side question to follow up, was it conscious on your part to focus on women characters for the film, and also the labor of women, like sewing or preparing the sambal or weaving? Was it like a conscious decision, or was it just it played out organically? What was the base? I'm quite intrigued by the choice. Yeah.
Well, initially when we started, we thought that we would look at very discrete objects, like Madam C's butterfly sewing machine, right? There are plans to do something, and then the pestle and mortar from Mrs. Goh, and just focus on those things. But obviously, they are not actors, and they will not just display things that we want to look at. About the gender issue, I mean, it was life in the house, and much of what happens in the house is what you see, which is actually nothing. Nothing really happens in the house. It's day-to-day upkeep, maintenance, washing, cleaning, cooking, some sewing, which could be more of a hobby or a craft and a skill. That crafting that you saw, the person who was crafting is obviously takes pride in what she's doing, and she explains it, right? Most of the things she does not explain. I think only perhaps Madam C is quite forthcoming and brave, and she's also outgoing as a character. But you will see that the others don't speak as much, only on the things that they hold very dear, like when Mrs. Goh goes and opens the and you can see that she has great pride in the things that she's keeping. The gender part, I mean, I'm not really sure, but I think that the domestic sphere is clearly where a lot of this happened. And quite honestly, I think that when we made an unrelated film, Three Flats, it came organically because it seemed like more women were willing to talk to us rather than men. And men usually didn't want us to go into the house. And women seemed to be more welcoming and more forthcoming to us.
Anything to add, Thomas?
I would say, again, looking back, it was during COVID, and it wasn't easy to get, elders especially who are in the vulnerable group to actually volunteer. So I guess, they were the bravest ones and say, sure, come on in, let's be part of this, filmmaking process. But what was interesting looking back, it does kind of echo a lot of the theme about domesticity, about labor, right? About care as well, right? Looking at how Madam C, very carefully care for the sewing machine and then putting, a cloth over to protect it. I think those are very often overlooked aspect of domestic life, right? Because we're so busy people here in Singapore. And like you said, that film actually allows us to slow down, to take note of those moments of care that we tend to overlook in our busy life.
I guess even laundry, right? Doing laundry, taking in the poles and so on. I mean, that house has a duality of things which are very fast and smooth and things which are quite slow and not of our time, like the bamboo poles, which are still on, instead of using the metal ones, the bamboo is still being used because it's more durable. And placed in, and the big clips, slowly putting them up. You could use dryer, but they don't do it because it spoils the clothes. So I guess there are certain things that to be taught about which seem very mundane and everyday, but it also tells you a little bit about what is the emphasis of our society today as we move off, and what are the priorities that society takes on today, and what has been left behind, and whether we need to reconsider. And I suppose this question of heritage is also in this, it doesn't really end, right? Thomas was just asking me just now, like, what was it a conscious decision to put a national anthem at the end? I don't know. This is Ian's way of ending. I suppose it is, in some way, you are looking at 5 citizens who are cast in the frame, five people who are citizens. Whether you think of them as productive or unproductive, depending on the lens at which we see this city and the way value is given. And heritage is about value. It's about what do we value. I suppose the film itself also tries not to give a value. It gives it a little bit open, and so that as a viewer you are collaborating with us to find the value and complete the picture. So the value is still contingent upon the audience who's viewing it, and then you decide where is this heritage? What am I looking at? What is valuable? Is it the objects? Is it the people, the practices, all of it? Where am I in this?
And the last relationship I'd like to discuss is your relationship with your discipline, because you belong to the architectural discipline. So, and we have many architecture students in this room. I was wondering, in light of this film, if we are able to reconceptualize the architectural like altogether. So what becomes of architecture after this film, or through this film, or beyond this film? It's a truly transdisciplinary project, and curators also are prompted to reconsider what is the curatorial, right? And the archivist is also prompted to reconsider what is the archival, right? Or heritage advocate would be prompted to consider what is heritage. So for you, what becomes of the architectural?
Wow. Okay. I'm not sure how to answer that question. It's so loaded. But anyhow, I ran a class some time back, and it was about making a film. And I start by saying that architects are storytellers. Of course, we have other ways of telling stories, right? We shape the space, we look at materials, we understand how relationships evolve and can be even transformed or change through the way we organize space. So in a way, we're also storytellers, but we use a different medium. So film becomes a very important medium for us to really understand lives of people, using filmic techniques, right, lighting and things like that, that will help us to become better architects, and also to be more empathetic Because when you tell a story, you need to have a character. What is this person doing? How is she feeling today? How do you begin to draw, describe that? What kind of space will this person feel good in? So all these things have a lot of things to do with film and with how we design spaces. Yeah.
It's a very loaded question, but it's also, I think, quite an important question which we ask ourselves. Every time we try and get a grant, we have to justify how it is related to the discipline, right? And obviously, the further it is from the discipline, although we see the connection that is visual, and architecture is visual, film is visual, is looking at a building, and then they say, well, why don't you do the history of the building? Why are you doing this history of the occupants? Why are you doing post-occupancy rather than the building itself? So these are interesting questions because I suppose that the film itself is collaborating with the occupant and the building and constructing this narrative that Thomas is talking about, right? It's constructing this narrative and it is an essay film because it has a position. It's not giving you the start to the end. In some way, you are like a fly on the wall, and you come in the middle of things, and you are looking at things that are all around you. You are inside the room, just watching. So the film itself, I would say, is very much of the way in which we track where architecture could go. Architecture might be very isolated in terms of we might isolate people in their little spaces, or you can say that the elders here have been actually very fortunate in that they have a room to call their own and a flat to call their own. But I think that film is also an art form in itself, and the artists and art forms have a privilege of living something unfinished. They leave you there at a destination, and then you're supposed to find your own way out, wherever that is. And figuring a scene is what that is. You figure out where you are in relation to the 6 elements of your exhibition. I mean, it's so fresh in my mind because Sid and I just conducted a class this morning on it. So it's not that I have prodigious memory. I just did it. But these 6 elements itself and their relationships, you have to map it out yourself. You have to figure out yourself. And I suppose as an art form, film does that. But architecture is quite different in that it has to fulfill functional needs. And there's money involved, right? And there's a population, especially public housing, is difficult because you don't know who you're designing for. You're designing for the masses, which means everyone, but also no one in particular, right? So I suppose that a little bit more dialogue, as Thomas said, between these different art forms that are, in many ways, some of these films that are made, and they could be like Tan Pin Pin's documentaries, they are quite prescient of a future. They can tell us where we are heading because they show us, they are a mirror to something that's happening, which we normally don't see, but they freeze the moment, right, in that point of where the camera actually takes like this 25 minutes and you see something that's there, but you missed it. So I suppose that it's like a conscience for architecture, if you want to put it. Like the art form is a conscience, a form of conscience. And we need to work with all these different art forms to come back to where we are. And you're figuring a scene. It's interesting, the city bit, which has the HDB, and the various documents that you have put up, the fire, the raising of the squatter in inverted commas settlements. As you said, the historian says, is it really that the village, the hamlet and the squatter settlement, is it really that archaic? Is that not a more modern form of living than the way we are now put into little holes where the flat and is organized? So that is, I think there are interesting questions which are placed, and there are no real answers to them, because it is an art form, And that wooden thing, which is quite beautiful as an object to look at without any context, and then you find out that it's about labor, people building the flats themselves, but also the precarity of the height and episodes of suicides from these blocks, these new blocks where people had aspirations to live, and then there's death. These conflicts and contradictions of how you read to figure out the scene, I think is the same function as a film. And the scene is there. It is for us to occupy and figure out. And architecture maybe needs to do a little bit more figuring out and less about fitting into presumed needs and requirements which may not be there.
Yeah, that's a beautiful response. And I think with that, we can open the floor for questions. Yeah. So if you have one, there are mics around. You can just, yeah. Okay. Yeah, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Lilian, for sharing. So I definitely learned a lot from this film about the everyday experiences and knowledge from residents from Wompo. So I guess my question is about, I realize there are lots of craft work, if I can call it, sewings and also weavings of objects, right, into as part of their life. To me, that really resonates with me. I feel like they are creating their own individual and tiny space within these HDB spaces. So my question is that, could you share with us more about your experience, observation, or perspective on how does this craftsmanship and tactility relates with their everyday life and spatial-wise? Thank you.
The time of craft within the everyday. So how does craft happen in the in the organic process of the everyday? Yeah.
Maybe I'll take the question a little bit. May not answer your question, but it's just taking the keywords of the question, right? Craft requires time and patience. It requires space, because you have to have the space to keep the butterfly sewing machine, which is actually a big object in itself, Madam C folds it up, and then it, like, hey presto, magic. It's flat, folds it up, and then covers it with this cloth and pushes us in. But it needs space, it needs time. Two things that we don't have very much of in Singapore. Because if there's a better place, we'll put something else, we'll throw it away and put something more useful, right? And craft is not necessarily useful. It is interesting, it could be beautiful, it could be intriguing. Whether it's useful or not, that's another question. But of course, we have a history of the sewing machine, which used to be, we had more sewing machines than we did televisions in the 1970s in Singapore. Homes were buying sewing machines because that was a very useful thing to have, and people mended their own clothes. And we had an industry, a cottage industry of contract workers who took home assignments to their home, women mostly, and did their jobs there. So you already have home-based workers as early as that, and very independent as well, and a side income. But to come back to your question of craft, right, I think that even the pestle and mortar is a craft object. It could fit in a museum anywhere at maybe 20 years from now. You want to buy a pestle and mortar now, there are very many variations of it. And the oldest ones used to be, the heavier it is, the better it would be. So you see her moving it. I think we didn't film her lifting it up. Maybe she did not lift. Maybe Ian helped her to lift it up to the sink. But she moved it with a cloth underneath so that it would not vibrate, and it was like you had to dampen the sound. So interestingly, the kitchen as well was one of the first big shifts, right, from a ground floor on the ground where all these sounds would be absorbed by the ground, and then you move yourself up to the HDB, which you're in the air, and then sound transfers through the floors, through all the structures, and then it reverberates down. So you think, oh my God, my neighbor is so irritating, they're knocking something, right? And this pounding. So I think that this idea of slowness and space and time is in craft. And this kind of weaving that you need to actually piece together and look carefully and not, like the weaving, you can't just force it because it's blocked. You can't weave the next piece. I think it's an interesting thing. And I suppose that younger people of your generation now are interested in craft, in going back to the analog, to do something that has real materiality, because we have a lot of the virtual already. And that's how civilization is, right? When you have too much of one thing, you go back to something that you don't have and you balance it out.
Talking about sewing machines, in terms of the number of collections that we managed to get from the elders, sewing machine ranked number 1. Exactly what Lilian you mentioned, right? Through your research, you identified that during that time, it was really a very, very important, very useful artifact. And also at a time where, people live in a lot more thrifty manner. So if things are kind of torn, I remember another elder would say, I would just have to sew my kids' school uniform, right? If there's a hole and things like that. So to them, it's very different life than we are living right now. The other thing is also if this group of people that we feature in the film, they are elders. They do have time. And also, the South Foundation has been very, very active in encouraging the elders to take up craft. And they run craft workshops at the Wampo Community Center. The goal is really to keep the elders active, right? Maintain a degree of well-being, dexterity as well, right? Figuring out how to put things together, how to fold, how to make origami animals and things like that. So that's part and parcel of encouraging the elders to be active. So not surprising, you see Madam Lim, right, making that potentially very beautiful handbag or purse, out of recycled materials.
I suppose craft also involves creativity, which is known already through medical research to have a positive effect on a real positive effect on calming people down, on solving things like depression. It has real physiological benefits and medical benefits.
Yeah, more question from. Yeah.
Hello. I don't know is it a correct question or not, because I realized there is something unusual about the motion of the film. Because usually when we film something, we set the camera, the setting, 25 frames per second, right? But I realized that in this film, I think the film rate is much higher than that. I'm not sure if I'm correct or not, but I think there's something unusual there. So I want to ask if there, like, why we do this? Do we do this on purpose? On what specific purpose? If we set that unusual frame rate for the camera.
Actually, I mean, it's a technical question. It's a good question. I do not know because I only watched. I got the edits and then we discuss it. I thought that actually it was made slow. When you looked at it, I didn't think that it was made faster. I thought it was lagging a little bit, and I wondered just now when I was looking at it whether it was the internet connection that was causing it to lag. Yeah, but it's an interesting question. So you think that actually it's been hastened, the speed? Yeah. Oh, okay.
So maybe a next discussion will be on that. Yeah, thanks for that insight. Yeah, and observation. I think there's one question. Oh, after then this guy here. Yeah, you first. Yeah. Oh,
Me?
I think so. Yeah, you have the mic.
Yes, yes, I have the mic. Hello, Thomas and Lilian. So actually, okay, my question would be that, cause I was quite attracted to the cabinet where like we will assume that it's the grandchild's cabinet, but it's actually the adult 50-year-old child's cabinet with all the, yeah, with all the stickers, and I thought that it's like quite nice because I think in the film they don't really there's not much focus shown on like the younger generation, but it's like their presence is there probably because they grew up with the parents in the estate. So it's like I quite appreciated that segment, and I thought if it's like maybe there's more footage of like the children's traces, but then like you've edited it out to focus more on the elderly. I wanted to ask that. Yeah.
I think that actually I really appreciate Madam C's very witty repartee with Ian. I mean, she's actually having a conversation with Ian, and this it was captured like this is not my Ian answered. These stickers, right? She's has a humor, right? A kind of sharp, kind of interesting humor that would make the whole people laugh. And I look at the film again and watch this, and I still laugh at the same the same time when I see this. No, yeah, you're right. It's interesting also, I mean, we didn't think about this, about the traces of all the people who had lived in that house, right? And when this thing was made, it was 2021, and finished in 2022. Now we're already 2024, right? Thomas started the project and got the grant at 2020, end of 2020? Middle of 2020 in August, right? So it's been more than 4 years since the whole thing started. Of course, with time, I suppose even everyone has aged, including us. It was 4 years ago. Actually, Madam C looks good now, very good. I think that there's an interesting thing about having traces in the house, and the house always keeps its occupants. It always keeps traces of the occupants, and that's why aging in place is recommended, because so we're doing this paper on dementia, and I'm also learning about it together with our RA James, that when you age in place and your cognitive faculties are failing, one of the things that happens is when you have objects around you, you build new memories and present memories, new ones, as you interact with these objects, and not because as you forget old things. So it kind of like it's like a replacement, and you don't see that things are just being depleted. You build new things because you don't move smoothly through the house. You always you rub against things, and you figure out things. So figuring out things seems to be a very important aspect throughout our lives, and even as we age and even as we forget. So this idea of traces of people who have left, people who have grown up, people who have gone away, still remains in the house.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, guys. I thought it was very interesting because I come from a very different background to architecture, and also I recently moved to Singapore, so the whole thing was very interesting. I guess my question is, because there's so many things happening in the day, how did you choose which hours of life to film, and what was your thought on choosing what to present to the audience in the film? Thank you.
I think I'll take this one. Sorry, can I ask what background you come from? I'm a lawyer. Oh, okay. That's so interesting. Okay. Okay, so we did pre-filming research first. Pre-filming research. So Thomas was with Peter Chen, was scanning objects, and we had already identified certain objects that we were interested in. And we had done some research, which is why we know about the sewing machine and so on. And we were, obviously with the sewing machine, you need to do it when there's light. And daylight is always the best, because even with a lamp, you get shadows and you can see. All of it was filmed during daytime, also because daylight lends itself best to a film, which actually looks at the interior, and the exterior will be quite different. So it was our experience, but also out of that, we wanted to focus on particular things that we had already pre-researched. So it is kind of planned. And also we had to agree with them which time was good for them. We just cannot barge into the house and say, let's start the cameras rolling, yeah.
So yeah, we have two more. I mean, we can take two more questions from the audience. So anyone? Yeah. Oh. After Lily, our friend here. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that film. That was another great one, Lilian, that you've done. So I happen to know Whampoa. I think the curating Whampoa, I was there when the elders came in to share objects with the younger people. So this actually is really my life. I'm trying to figure out what is it that keeps me happy with my objects, right? So I wanted to go back to the question on design. I understand what you're saying, that you cannot design a home for an elderly person or a nursing home that caters to everything. But yet we all know that it's really important. Sometimes we hear stories where old people forcibly moved out of their home to go into a nursing home, and within weeks and months, they pass on. So that's a real problem. And I'm just wondering what kinds of design approaches can you have that would guide an older person moving in. For example, I've seen some of the new HDB studios for older people, and I think we have to go beyond grips and non-slippery floors and all that shit, right? I mean, sorry, all that stuff. we got to get to how people actually want to live. Is it certain kinds of shelving? Is it certain kinds of kitchen? What is it that keep older people happy? So that when they move, they continue to thrive, because your objects for thriving sounds like it's objects for thriving for now, right? So and a lot of these people are actually quite healthy, they're mobile and all that. So figuring out a scene is really important for an old person, because I'm trying to figure out for myself, if I cannot live in my apartment, I have to move somewhere, what am I going to take with me?
I've been waiting for a question like that, actually, so that I can tell a story. So bear with me. So how did social curating and archiving started? In fact, it started with a visit to a Whampoa elder by the name of Jessie Tang, right? So Jessie came to me and say, good news, I'm moving to the studio apartment, right? It's smaller, it's easier to clean, and it's more. And she is able to use the sale of the 4-room flat that she was living at the time in order to support her life, right? The remaining time that she has. So she right size, to use the phrase that we commonly use, she right size. But she said the bad news is that I have so many things in my 4-room flat, I do not know what to do with them. And they were very, very important to her. Cantonese opera singer posters, objects from Tang's, the departmental store, because she worked there for nearly 40 years. Toilet paper covers in the past, which I've never seen before. So she said, what am I going to do with this? I said, well, is it possible to bring it with you to the studio apartment? She said, no way, it's just too small. So that was a really big problem. Yes, the floors are non-slip, there are grab bars, but what about all those things that help her to thrive for this 40 years? She had to throw away, she told me. So what we did was we actually reached out to the film archive. I reached out to the CEO of Tangs, and they all came to her home. And we had a small little party. She prepared the Milo drinks, a few cakes, some grapes. Imagine the CEO of Tangs sitting in her 4-room flat, and she was narrating Tangs during that time. And she had a little photo of a Christmas party in Tangs and say, I think that's you in the photo, that little baby. And the Tangs CEO has never seen that before and say, oh my God, I need to have this photo. Then came the film archive folks and said, you know what? We've never seen all these Cantonese film star, opera stars and all that. Can we digitize them so that we have a copy? So that social archiving and curating became a very powerful way for Jessie to so-called give away. And it was very powerful. At the end, she says, it's so nice that I can give away these things while I'm still alive, rather than having, relatives throw them away or, things like that. So there is a very interesting project in Hong Kong. It's in Ngau Tau Kok, and it's for seniors. And do you know what they do is that along the public maybe we can call it the public square, right? The columns have little showcases where they'll get the elders to showcase their works, whether it's craft or things they have collected over the years. And as you're walking along the corridor, you see them talking to their neighbors and say, that's my this and that, that's this and that. And it was so amazing. There's this sense of community. So talking about design, I think we need to definitely be a lot more empathetic. We need to listen. We need to also encourage that kind of longevity of their lives through the objects, through the memories, rather than just meeting the basic need. But that would require a whole different paradigm shift mindset in how we design for the elderly population.
I want to add about design. This question is very present even for me now, also because as a sandwich generation, I have mothers and aunts and in-laws who are aging rapidly, right? And the question is that why do we design things like nursing homes, which not only the elders don't want to stay in, but visitors also don't want to visit, right? The problem is that we institutionalize aging, and it's very difficult because we have a colleague who in architecture and also in medicine, Dr. Amy Kiyota, who's doing great work, who's done great work with her Ibasho concept in Japan, and she's brought it to Singapore. And we hope that that kind of idea that we need to change, as Thomas said, the paradigm from one of just safety and guardrails to think of a way of living that may be slower but is enriched by other values, maybe not speed and maybe not productivity in the way we understand it, but being productive in another way, and be open to reconfiguring what is valuable in that. Emmy was having lunch with me last week, and one of the things she said was very interesting, that why can't we design it like instead of nursing home, why can't it be like a museum that people want to go to? Like children can go and play next to their grandparents who are there. Why is it like so segregated and isolated? And I suppose that really requires us to rethink architecture, particularly, not just that we have done our due diligence by ticking the boxes.
I'm sorry, it's something that is so close to my heart. Now, the architect that was in charge of that Ngau Tau Kok housing estate in Hong Kong, I asked him, I said, how was it like, this whole process? He would say it was a nightmare because the number of meetings that he need to have with the elders is almost endless, right? And there's so many needs that they want. And the most challenging one was we want the trees to be there. We don't want them to be removed. And he and his team need to figure out how to keep the trees over this 2 years of construction, right? So there's so much of investment and commitment, but I asked him, what do you think now that the development is, the housing estate is done? And he said, will you do it again? And he said, yes, I would do it again, because he saw how invested, how proud the seniors were when they were living there. But it's not easy.
Yeah, please. I think you have a question. Yeah.
I want to thank you for your very touching film. And I have to admit, I was most struck by the care and the maintenance for the objects at home, and that comes across as touching. And I'm struck also by the audience that you seem to have brought in, because the age I was expecting with this theme, that the audience would be much older, and you guys are so much younger than I am, which I find amazing. So back to maintenance and care, I think it implies continuation of the before, the today, and the future, in a way represented by your students. And I want to say that the continuation is so significant. It's a little difficult for me to find my train of thought again. Anyway, I did have I want to applaud you that you are here and that you're caring for the objects as well, as much as we do. But the question that actually it results in is this continuation is a little bit hard to achieve with a grant, because what I wanted in the end is I wanted the film to be longer, and I wanted to know how it continues, because this generation has different problems. They are migrating their data from a phone to a new phone. It's not the object anymore. So the phone goes, and it doesn't, and nobody cares. So there is a transition now that I'm noticing, and which I find is a relevant thing in a museum also, or a gallery, to address. This transition is to what do we do when virtual data is being transmitted and objects are not cared for anymore. So back to the continuation of your funding. You have been funded by a grant. Will there be a future? A second and a third? I think it's not a question of 1, 2, or 3. This should be continued, because what I see in this movie is a snapshot that needs to be continued, because we need to make dot after dot in order to understand thriving and continuation, because that's what we need. We, all of us, need, even more so the younger generation. We need continuation in order to gain security, safety, and the sense of existence.
It's the future for, yeah.
Thank you. That was really a beautiful summation, and really, I think we're all very heartened that you, audience who comes in without any knowledge. I mean, the students Some of them are from our class, so maybe they are forced to come listen to us. That's just to be honest. But it's great because you are definitely not from our group and you appreciate the film. So that's, for us, that's a big thing, you know, like just if we just have one, Lily, for example, comes in and gives us the young lawyer who's sitting next to you, right? We really delighted by that. I don't know about I think Thomas just showed me before I came at around 1 that we promised that this would be a pilot. Did we promise it?
No one from NHB is here, so yeah, kind of.
Oh, we said that this would be a pilot and we would do 6 small essay films about placemaking in Whampoa. Yeah, but we didn't say we would do it, but then we just wrote it down. There will be this kind of thing. But it's a great idea because it's like a longitudinal study across time, which is, as you said, continuity, but also a sustained documentation across time to try and understand. And I'm very interested as well because I have been thinking about this, about AI. We all have frequent conversations about AI because we are probably the generation where there's a transition between the mechanical and the manual. And we have seen at a time when there were no phones. I mean, phones were actually attached to the wall and plugged in and you had to go and put a coin in or whatever it is, right? You don't take it out from your pocket. It wasn't that. And there was no internet. I went through that time. But many in the audience did not go through that time and do not understand what it was. And certainly the materiality of the objects are very precious, being able to see how big and how heavy, what they are made of, how thick things are, how fragile the needle is, how small it is, how well made it is. Madam C oiling the machine itself in the little holes with the oil as well, which I think is also, and the way she kept it with that tissue paper to stop it from leaking. I mean, these are, in some ways, it's also being thrifty and saving, you know, this idea of like we're sustainable. There was already a sustainability movement long before it was called that, sustainable. People were saving things, they were saving the things that they did and mending the stuff. I think that is interesting because we are the generation between, that's the older generation, and then there's the new generation who will maybe not miss the objects and will have all the AI. It's an interesting conundrum because these objects will also need space to be kept. And at some point, maybe they will not be as lucky as Jessie Tang. Is it Jessie Tang, her name? Yeah. Who had that opportunity to give away and let her objects be cherished by another audience. But definitely, I think it would be a good thing if we could find some way to have that possibility of continuity through passing it down and giving it another life. That would be great. Thomas.
Part of the project involved digitizing the objects and putting them on the website. So I can see one member of the audience like, oh, don't do that. But you know what was amazing was when I showed it to Madam Z on the iPad, and then she began to play around and say, I could never see the bottom of the sewing machine. This is the first time in so many years. Because of course it's so heavy, right? How can you just overturn it and look at the bottom of the sewing machine? So with one flip, she said, oh, that's how it looks like. I still remember. So, wow, I never thought of it, right? We know that it's heavy, but from her very curious way of playing with it, and she said, I could never see the bottom of it, But definitely, I think the transition that you're talking about is not like sort of overnight everyone becomes like that. There's always a kind of a lag, right? And the transition is uneven. And there's also like, I think Lilian, you were saying also, some of the younger generations are going back to the analog. Like my daughter, right? She goes to thrift store, she would buy vinyl, and I said, I used to have lots of them. And she said, what happened to them? You know, so I was the one that actually threw them away. And she looked at me and said, how can you ever do such things? So it's not so kind of straightforward, right? I think the younger generations are also beginning to understand their aspect of materiality and other forms of living that not necessarily has to be all in the digital world.
I think with that we can please help me thank Lilian and Thomas for such a wonderful talk. And
Thank you, Patrick.
thank you.
And thanks to the audience
Thanks,
as well.
Patrick.
And thank you all for coming, for being a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all
Thank you
for
to Madam C again.